Bobby and Suzanne began to slap Tyler and Marvin around. They called them nasty names and would often leave them home alone. Hi there. My name is Seth, and I am having a hard time deciding whether or not I did something bad. Maybe after you hear my story, you can let me know what you think. So let me start off by saying that my parents were amazing. They were patient and very attentive, but they didn't buy me everything that I ever wanted. It wasn't like they denied me anything. If I wanted a toy, they always gave me goals for me to achieve, in order to earn it. I was fairly young, so it wasn't like I could do a lot, really. But if I wanted a new video game, my father would want me to help him rake leaves in the yard or to cut the grass twice a week for 2 months. And so long as I did my chores without complaining, they would buy whatever it was that I was working towards. I honestly never thought that things would ever change, but while traveling for work on their private plane, my parents were caught in a terrible storm that caused their plane to crash, and both of them died that day. I was only 8 at the time, and I really didn't know how to process the pain that I was feeling. I did have extended family, but none of them could be found, and so I was placed up for adoption. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait long as a family came to my rescue and adopted me only a week later. They were a young couple named Bobby and Suzanne, and they had newborn twins named Tyler and Marvin, but loved the idea of having an older child as well. I don't know if the agency did a thorough background check on them, and I highly suspect that they didn't, but they seemed decent enough, and the agency needed to make room at the orphanage, which was overcrowded. Bobby and Suzanne, though, would prove to be among the worst people I had ever met. As soon as they brought me home, they showed me to my room, which was only big enough for a single bed and an end table that they told me was for my clothes. Seeing that made me very worried. It wasn't like I had expected them to live in a mansion like I used to, but I at least expected a room that was slightly bigger than a closet. I said as much to Bobby, and he slapped me hard across the face. "What's the matter? Do you think that you're too good for us? This is your new room, and if you don't like it, then I suggest you begin to pretend like you do, or there is plenty more where that came from." Bobby raised his fist as if he was going to slap me again, and I flinched and fell to the floor. Suzanne, meanwhile, was just laughing at me.
"The poor little boy, such a scaredy cat."
"You'll stay in this room unless we tell you that you can leave it. Do you understand?" I nodded, out of fear. They wouldn't let me out of that room to do anything other than chores, school, and to eat. Although the meals that they provided for me were barely edible. They would often feed me bread, water, and if I was lucky, applesauce. Meanwhile, the twins were beginning to grow up, and while I had to follow millions of rules, they were allowed to roam free and do whatever they wanted to. Bobby and Suzanne would often say that as their adopted child that I was no better than just a servant that they allowed to have their last name. They didn't care about me at all and would always tell me that I was worthless and that I wouldn't amount to anything in life. As I got older, they even began forcing me to babysit the twins when they would go out, and they went out very often. Both Tyler and Marvin began to see me as the third parent and would often actually prefer me to their actual parents. Even though I wasn't old enough to watch them, I did my best to keep them safe, and the three of us really began to bond as brothers. My relationship with them was the one ray of sunshine in my otherwise bleak life. Between school and all the chores that my adopted parents forced on me, playing with my brothers was the one source of joy I had, but that all changed when I turned 15. I remember sitting in my room all by myself, crying since it was my birthday, and no one cared. At least I thought so until my brothers slid a drawing under my door. It was a picture that they drew of the three of us playing, and it had the words, "Happy Birthday, Big Brother," poorly written on it. It made me feel so happy, but then I heard Bobby and Suzanne talking in the kitchen, and what they were saying worried me. "We need to kick him out now. The money that we are getting from the government is barely covering the cost of feeding him. Plus, sooner or later, he'll get bigger than us, and then we won't be able to bully him to do things anymore. We'll just figure something out, but he has to go." As soon as they finished arguing, they stormed down the hall to my room and dragged me out of the house and threw me into their car. They then drove me to the other side of the city and told me to get out. But where am I? What am I supposed to do here? "We don't know, and we don't care. Just get out." Before I could say anything else, they drove off. I couldn't believe it. They had abandoned me and left me with nothing more than the clothes on my back. I'm sure it was by sheer accident, But they had abandoned me in front of a homeless shelter, and without knowing where else to go, I wandered into the building. The man that was running the shelter noticed me as soon as I walked in and rushed over to me to find out what was wrong. He could tell by the look on my face that I was in distress. "Hi there, little guy. Are you lost?" More like thrown away. Then told him what had just happened to me and how my adopted parents had been treating me for years, and he just nodded his head as he listened. As rough as my story was, it was one that he had heard many times before, and sadly wasn't surprised. Well, that is a tragedy for sure. I wish I could do more for you, but the best I can offer is a room upstairs in my apartment. I live above the shelter, and you're welcome to be my roommate, but only on the condition that you stay in school. I didn't know what else to say. The idea that all I had to do was go to school, and he would let me stay with him, felt like a very fair trade, and so I took him up on his offer. He was truly appreciative of how I would do chores around the house and the shelter without being asked, and praised me for doing so even. This confused me though, as I was just doing them more so, as just an instinctual thing. I had been forced to do chores all my life, and so it just felt natural to keep doing them. But unlike Bobby and Suzanne, John gave me credit and thanked me often for all my help. As I grew older, John helped me to save up so that I could eventually go to college. But the day that he brought home a computer for me to use to study was the turning point for me. I found that I was an expert when it came to using that computer, and I loved to surf the internet. In fact, that was when I discovered that there were people that made content for the internet as their careers, and I wanted to be one of them. I started making videos of me playing games, and while it took a bit for people to notice me and start following my videos, I nevertheless started to build up a massive following of people, and that was when I started making money through advertisers. So much, in fact, that I was able to pay for my entire college tuition without having to borrow a single penny. I still volunteered in the shelter, though, as it made me happy to help those that were less fortunate than myself. Even after I graduated from college and got myself my own apartment, I still made sure to spend a large portion of my free time at the shelter, making sure that the people that came there were always well-fed and treated with respect. A few years later, when I was 25, I was working at the shelter when I suddenly saw two young men that looked vaguely familiar. As they came up to me to ask for food, I instantly threw my arms around them and hugged them deeply. They were confused at first, but once I said their names, they embraced me as well. "Tyler? Marvin? Is that you?" After a lot of tears and a hearty meal, they began to tell me that after Bobby and Suzanne had kicked me out, things began to go downhill for them as well. Without me there to take out their frustrations on, Bobby and Suzanne began to slap Tyler and Marvin around. They called them nasty names and would often leave them home alone. When the twins were 15, they decided that they needed to leave just like I did, and so they struck out into the world. The problem was that they had nearly no money and they instantly became homeless. They had been begging for money ever since. As soon as I heard this, I hated my adopted parents even more. It was bad enough that they kicked me out, but for them to treat their own flesh and blood that way was beyond disgusting. I knew that I had to reclaim my role as their big brother, and I invited them to move in with me. Just like John had done for me, my only rule was that they had to go to school and to volunteer at the shelter. They readily agreed, but were worried that they would be too much of a burden on me. However, I assured them that the money that I made from being an influencer was only part of my income. The much bigger portion came from all the investments that I was making. You see, I went to college to refine my knowledge of the stock market and currencies, and that's where a lot of my money came from. After a few months, a reporter came to the shelter and asked if they could take some photos for a piece that they were working on, and I agreed. They took photos of me, Tyler, and Marvin, and wrote a story about how wealthy I was, and how wonderful it was that I had volunteered at the shelter for so many years. I didn't think anything of it, but then a few weeks later, Bobby and Suzanne showed up at the shelter and demanded to speak with me. "Hey you, well, looks like you made something out of yourself after all. That's just as well. Now you can pay us back for all the money that we wasted on you when you were younger."
Yeah, you should take care of us now.
What are you two idiots going on about? You two barely did anything for me other than behave like abusive and dangerous people. I'm amazed that the three of us are even alive today in spite of all that you did. You ungrateful brat, you owe us for taking you in when your stupid parents died. Ungrateful for what? You treated me like a slave and locked me in a small room and took advantage of me and forced me to do manual labor when I should have been a child enjoying life. Oh, that's it. I've had enough lip out of you. I'll show what talking back gets you. I saw him wind up and get ready to slap me, and even though I could have stepped back and dodged him, I wanted him to hit me. I wanted to show him that he didn't have power over me anymore, and so I stayed put and took the slap on my face and just kept staring at him. At least that was the idea. But once he slapped me, it triggered something in me, and I went into a rage, and I jumped onto Bobby, and I began to punch him until he lost consciousness. Suzanne couldn't do anything other than look on in horror as I punched Bobby over and over again. Eventually, police showed up, and Bobby demanded that I got to prison, but after hearing from the people in the shelter about what had happened, the police took my side. They decided that I had acted in self-defense and that they wouldn't press charges against me. I, however, did press charges against Bobby, and as it turned out, this wasn't his first run-in with the law. The officers that arrested him told me that Bobby had quite the rap sheet and was known to get drunk and start fights. When the case was brought before a judge, he took one look at Bobby, and between his many offenses and the fact that he had assaulted a volunteer at a homeless shelter, he sentenced him to prison for 5 years. This made me and the twins feel very victorious. While Bobby was gone, Suzanne really struggled for a bit, but ended up shoplifting to try to make ends meet and ended up getting herself arrested as well. With both of them in prison, they lost their house, and things are going to be very difficult once they are released. As for the twins, they recovered nicely from their time living on the streets, and they are currently in college. One is in school to become a lawyer, while the other is going to become a dentist. And I couldn't be more proud of them. They now see me as their one and only parent, as they have disowned Bobby and Suzanne, and have sworn to never speak to them ever again. As for me, I have more money than I will ever know what to do with, and I have begun donating large amounts to the shelter and other shelters around the city. So there you have it. So do you think I overreacted when I attacked Bobby, or do you think I was justified?